I was ambitious enough to try that. And again, I won't kind of cover this, but again, this is, I think over the years, kind of growing up in the Agile community and really pushing it towards business agility, really pushing lean startup and design thinking and business modeling. I mean, if you all go scroll back any YouTube talk I've given at any like Agile DC or big Agile conference stuff, it's always been around this stuff. I've always been pushing it. So it's just really cool to see it. 10 years in, I feel like we're still probably early adopter stage at a lot of these concepts. But the idea here is kind of like, why would I even write a book? Which is kind of the wrong way to think about this. Like you really shouldn't think of a book like a big business card. There's really no reason to think of it that way. So when I was writing it, and actually even before, Alex and I, my co-author, so he also created the business model canvas and the value prop canvas. And his new book, Invincible Company, just came out a couple months ago. So he's been really busy too. We started thinking about like, what are the challenges we see when we're working with companies? And for me, that's startup accelerators, but it's also a majority of big corporations. I spend a lot of time with emerging product groups, innovation groups, new product groups, any like corporate accelerators, corporate incubators, anybody that's in a corporation trying to do something new, I tend to get pulled into. And at first it's like, okay, so you have an idea, great, but where do you take that? Like, how's it get into a roadmap? Like, how do you test your way through it? And really over time, before you make this big decision on whether or not to go scale a thing and build out like several sprints worth of work and go burn it down, what we've been doing is saying, okay, well, how first do you ideate to make sure that you're playing in a space that makes sense for your company? And in reality, a lot of these innovation labs have been shut down, even out here in California. And they've been shut down because when they ideated, they went really far away from the core of the business and they didn't have guidelines. And they, unfortunately, you get about maybe 2 or 3 years of that before you get shut down. So you have to produce something that is as of interest anyway from a business side to, make a meaningful impact on the business, even if it's not just direct revenue, it's something else. And so the way you ideate really matters. And then creating business prototypes. And a lot of times, these are canvases or things you create that are like, here are the spaces we're going to play in, and here are the types of like business opportunities we see. And then how do you assess them? Alex has some great tips in his new book, actually the first business model generation book. It's about 10 years old now, 10 years old this year, I believe. Has some great tips even in that about how do you assess like a business, and then making a decision where to play. But then, the work of testing it, what are the hypotheses? What are the kind of assumptions you're making in the business opportunity? How do you design experiments for that? How do you run those and learn? And then how do you kind of feed that back into your decision-making process? And so what we found when working with teams was, on the business design side, you're probably like sketching out some canvases, right? Whether it be like a value prop canvas or like a business model canvas, right? And then on the other side, you're probably using some version of Agile or maybe even lean startup, and kind of testing. But we found that if teams kind of went too far on one side or the other, then they would fail in a big way, because on the business design side, you can create all these beautiful artifacts, but if you don't go test them, they're kind of just innovation theater until you go see if you're right. And then on the other side, if you just test without a business model, you might find traction on something, but then it'll never get funded by the corporation, by the core businesses, or it never kind of makes it out of the lab on a way that can kind of stand on its own 2 feet. And so we really saw this need for like balancing both. And then, after you've kind of gone through this kind of figure 8 several times, then how do you go and scale the thing based on good kind of business testing and design, but also going and testing in the market and testing beyond just the customer. So just kind of giving you some like behind the scenes looks of how we created the book, and also what we saw in the market and with the teams we work with on just, if you skew too far towards one side or the other, you could still fail kind of in a big way. I personally, experienced this outside DC, working at startups where we ran Agile like really well, but then we never had a business model that worked. And so that was not a fun experience where you're like, I feel like this should matter, but then when you, at the end of the day, you're delivering stuff to customers who don't want it, you're almost like efficiently creating waste. So it's like not the greatest experience in the world. So I think I'm sort of biased, having personally experienced that in my career. So I kind of come back to this idea of like, okay, why do you write a book? And then I love, this quote from Theodore Levitt, which is, people don't buy a 1/4-inch drill, right? They want a 1/4-inch hole. And so if you kind of think of the job to be done, right, the job behind, your product or even something like a book, then the question isn't like, why write a book? It's more of like, for what job does this book solve? And so what we really did is try to play agile thinking and design thinking and lean startup to creating a book, which I thought is a really interesting way to approach it, because most of the time you think about it as like a very waterfall process. And so we had, we had a job story. So, the job story for the book was, when I have a business idea, I want to be able to rapidly test it so that I don't build something that nobody wants. And when you think of it that way, it's almost like your product when you're thinking about features and what to put in and what not to put in. If you have this kind of guiding story, this kind of North Star, then it becomes easier to filter things instead of going, well, I don't know if this should be in or out, so let's just put it in. So this kind of job story helped us in our kind of guiding, process of, hey, are we actually on the right track? So we started thinking, okay, so what do people hire for this job? There were obviously books out there already. I've had the pleasure of working with Eric Ries in the past, who wrote Lean Startup. That's also like really taking from extreme programming and applying it to business. I think the first webinar I was ever on was Eric Ries and Kent Beck joined. I thought it was this amazing moment where Eric literally paused the webinar and he was like, wait, is that Kent Beck? And then Kent like types, yes, it's me, in the chat. But it was really just taking a lot of this old, like, I don't say old, but just the XP principles, agile principles, and applying them to business. Because let's face it, we've probably all worked on something that kind of looked like it should have worked, and in the end didn't, because we never really spent time with the customer. We never spent time kind of validating the model. We just kind of pumped things into like this machine, and it didn't pan out. So if you think about the book as a product, we should use agile principles to create it. We used iterative process, and I think it's one of the reasons it's been received really well is because we tested it along the way. And so really, if you start thinking about the gap I was trying to fill, was like, you have a BMC and you have your strategy and you have kind of your tests over here, but then this middle of like, how do you connect things in your strategy to your tests was kind of missing. And people had lists of stuff, but it's really hard. I don't know if you've had this experience where you go to a site or somewhere and they give you a list of like, here are all the things available. It's hard, it's overwhelming, you don't know what to choose. And so like, what's the process from like connecting your strategy to your tactics? And that's really kind of the need that we were trying to fill. So in it, I started thinking through, okay, so the job to be done behind the book, like who really benefits from this? And we came up with 3. One is the corporate innovator. So a lot of you probably live this role if you're inside a corporation. How do you push or nudge the corporation to more business agility, testing and learning, and doing so really quickly, especially if they're trying to go into a new market? The startup entrepreneur, like who is trying to create something new or basically explain something to their kind of co-founder in a way. And then we get the solopreneur, which I think is really interesting, which is somebody that has something on a side hustle or side project and they're working nights and weekends. And it's like, oh, like, how do you know whether you make this jump or not into this thing and quit your day job? It's a big risk. And it's really interesting when I talk to all 3 of these kind of personas. All of them are pretty risk averse. I think it's pretty interesting because we have this kind of stereotype that we're all like these big, crazy risk takers. And in reality, when I talk to these people and I work with them, they're like, this is the least risky thing I could be doing right now. Like in their world, it's like, no, I'm going to really just place my bets and going to make my way through this process. And it's like the least risky thing professionally I've done. And so it's just really fascinating when you talk about risk and entrepreneurs and everything and innovators, how for whatever reason it gets the stigma applied of like, being really risky and like kind of just Wild West innovation, but it's some of the most risk averse people I've ever met. So what we ended up doing is using the tools, we created, kind of visualized all the research into value prop canvases. So if you look here, you'll see this is the corporate innovator. And some of the jobs over here, like map your ideas and risk, collect in data and generate insights, socialize how we work. Some of the pains they kept coming up with were things like testing's really hard. I don't understand the process. This one came up time and time again, which is fear of damaging the brand. I work with some companies that have 100-year-old plus brand, and the idea that you would ever put anything out that's less than perfect is terrifying to them. And so there's a real risk that if you put out something as a test and, the tech blogs pick it up and write negatively about it, that it has real implications. Some of the gains they were looking for, things like impress leadership, so, like peer recognition, dollars to keep going, things like that. I won't read all of these, and then on the left, we said, okay, so the things that we're working on, this book and a library and a method, does that like solve for these jobs that they have? Does this actually address some of the jobs? And then if you look at the pain relievers, do these actually address the pains our readers have? And then the gain creators, do they address the gains that they're looking for? And I'm kind of scribbling this out, but basically, can you visualize and say, okay, and same with product development in Agile, you look at who are you trying to deliver value to? What are they trying to get done? The jobs, quite frankly, usually start with almost like tasks. They're very functional jobs. And then what are the pains they have around trying to do those jobs? And what are the gains that they're looking for when they finally able to do that job well? And you'll notice it's not just rewording either. It's not, wow, they need to map ideas and risk. And the pain is mapping ideas and risk. And the gain is, well, we mapped our ideas and risk. Like if you try to use these tools that way, you're not going to get a lot out of it. It's more about what are the jobs they're trying to do, and then doing research and doing discovery and finding out what are the things getting in their way, and then what are the things that are the gains. And sometimes, getting a promotion or something like that ends up being one of the gains where, it's more about social, right, peer recognition. The other thing I would point out about customer jobs here is they start off as tasks, right, functional, but they're also social and emotional and supporting jobs. I just try to keep things at a high level because I feel like jobs to be done can be a very waterfall-like process. If like I love Tony Alwick's work. I've had the pleasure of meeting him a few times. And there are other works pushing jobs to be done. Just be mindful of like applying it to your culture and your process, right? If you're trying to be agile, you're trying to go off and learn and kind of come back and update versus just execute on what the jobs are. So something to think about. We also map these out for the others. I won't read through all of these, but startup entrepreneurs, the biggest things there, they had a really tough time communicating with their co-founders. And I experience this when I'm working with accelerators all the time. And now that every accelerator is virtual, I feel like I'm doing a lot of Zoom workshops with accelerators right now. I just finished one for the EU. And the idea of like storytelling and having a coherent story has really been challenging for a lot of the co-founders that I've seen. They have scarce resources. That's one of the pains that keep coming up time and time again. Like, give me the cheapest, next best test I could run to move forward, And then they're looking for kind of evidence of traction keeps coming up with, are we making progress on not just the revenue side? Because so much early on when you're working through things, revenue is kind of a lagging indicator, and there are all these leading indicators you're looking for. So they kept like coming back to that as a challenge or a game they were looking for. And then solopreneurs, pretty close. Turn side hustle into a business was a big one. Fear of making the jump kept coming back as a pain, and stuff like that. So what we did is we took all this learning and we went up into the mountains in Switzerland above Lake Geneva. I have to say there are worse places to write a book. So when Alex, my co-author who lives in Lausanne, said, hey, we need to come up and go into the mountains and write this book, I was like, oh, okay, I guess, I guess you convinced me. But in all seriousness, like we did a lot of work, and except for the altitude sickness, it was really a good experience. But basically we started with stickies, and it was myself and Alex and Alan Smith, who is an amazing designer and was the lead designer on business model generation and value prop design, and also Invincible Company was there with us. And you look, this is, I know it's just like such a like agile thing to do, right? Use stickies, but we started unpacking like, what did we see with really great team design in our work? What are the things that helped some like teams succeed where others failed? What about the environment was either promoting this kind of work or kind of detracting from it? You can't read the sticky up here, but it's very much behavior is what we're talking about, kind of like in this box here. And we started just sticky noting it all out before writing a book. And I think that was a big learning experience for me, is when people talk about agile, but applied to something like this, it can feel like a very waterfall process to write a book. It's like you create your outline and then you write all your content and then you like test it and edit it, and like, but we said, let's not start writing. Let's just get aligned and at a sticky level. And then we also did a lot of sketches. And so this is one of my sketches from the experiment pitfalls spread, where you can see I literally just put lines here because I knew what these were, but I didn't want to clutter it up at the moment where we were sketching. And we said, okay, we asked ourselves, with all the teams we've worked with, what are the things that get in their way and these kind of like pitfalls they fall into trying to work this way? And mindset kept coming up time and time again. Like if you take this check the box mindset with experimentation, that's problematic. People run too many experiments. They'll try too many at once, which also relates to them being too long because they can't finish anything. So think traditional like lean and Kanban and flow, just like basically not following any of those rules, right? They can't find customers. That's another one that kept coming up. Like they can't find them or they can't get access to them. They can't, like the poor communication where they're just not able to kind of talk to each other and clearly explain what they're trying to do. And I mean, that happens in the agile world too, where, like one of my first big transformations I was involved in here in San Francisco was we started working in an agile way, but then we realized like the SOX controller wasn't involved, and they were like, how do we do CapEx and everything else? And like, we just poorly communicated what we were doing, or legal, right? That's the worst when you design all this stuff and then you go to legal and say, hey, can we do this? And legal's like, of course not. Why are you even like, and rather than incorporating legal earlier into communicating to them that this is what we're trying to do and the intent, there's all kinds of stuff with communication that can go wrong. We created a book map, which should look very much like a story map to you all. And it's not a coincidence because I picked that up from Jeff Patton, who's very influential in my career. And I thought, I'm not just going to write an outline. And we were distributed. So I'm based outside San Francisco. Alan is in Toronto. Alex is in Switzerland, over in Lausanne. We're traveling. And so we thought, how do we visualize the flow of the book? And it's sort of like, you have a map that goes across like this. And we started putting together the spreads. And this one's kind of an all over the place picture, but they started off as stickies and then they went to sketches and then they went to some of these black and white things. And I thought something was really telling, which again, biases creep in no matter what you're doing, is I was putting this visually together and I invited my peer, Andy Plantenberg, who I worked with at NEO, to give me feedback on it. And she looked at this top line of all these quotes and she's like, you just have old white men quotes. And I was like, no, I didn't mean to have just old white men. Like that stuff just seeps in, right? Because I search for business quotes and it's a bunch of old white dudes and I go, that's what I'm going to use. And so having feedback on something visually helped me really kind of course correct early on and go, okay, yeah, this got to be more diverse kind of quotes that support what I'm trying to do here. It also helped us move content around. So I would move like the library up and I'd move it to the back and to the middle, because there was always this risk, because it's 200 pages of experiments, that people would just like skip over the library, or they would just go right to the library and skip the rest of the content of the book. And so it was a lot of back and forth that helped us kind of align on that. We also did affinity sorting. So I would do early, and this is a real picture from the early interviews I did. I would interview people about the book when they're reading the content, and then I would sort their feedback into clusters to see, are there themes emerging that we have problems with? And even like over here with this one specifically, we started realizing that we had problems with some of the information that was missing, because there were clusters of things like what is needed here that's missing. And that helped us kind of pull out stuff earlier that was conceptually not sound. Some of the content are like the end of like, who do you think this book is for? you know, like all this stuff, like, you know, who else do you think would benefit? And trying to, it's like, oh, there's a cluster of product managers here. Okay. There's a cluster of like growth here. You know, there's like that kind of stuff. We could sort through qualitative feedback really early on. And it's the same when I'm working with agile teams and they need to do customer interviews. We would sort back through the qualitative like feedback really quickly to see what themes, because I think that's one of the dangers when I work with teams is sometimes they do interviews and then they're not sure how to sort the feedback, and then it doesn't become all that useful, and they pick out that one quote they wanted to hear and they go build the thing they wanted to anyway, which is not the point of the process. We tested a lot of content. So I tested the content through landing pages. And so this one got a lot, you can see, because on Medium, I can see where people highlight. I got a lot of good feedback on, oh, I shared this with my executive, or I shared this with other people. And I was just trying to test out this idea of sequencing, but I pared it down to just, you know, just pairing. But we tested a lot of the content, you know, earlier on. And then we brainstormed titles. So this is, of course, we take sticky notes to the top of like a mountain, of course. But, well, typically these are static, so they're electrostatic. They can just attach to the window. But a lot of these we were like testing out what are some of the titles. I really thought, I don't know where it is in this picture. I think it's over here. I really thought executing ideas was a cool title, because I was like, oh, you're executing ideas, but you're really just executing ideas. Nobody got the joke really. And the publisher's like, no, just just like call it what it does. We also tested covers. And so we hacked, in a way, the usertesting.com platform and basically uploaded pictures of the covers and then sourced corporate innovators, startup entrepreneurs, and solopreneurs to give us feedback on what they think. So it's more like a comprehension test, what they think the book is about based on looking at the image. And I'll play one for you if the audio works. And if not, we'll just skip it over. But I do have all these videos and they're so hard for me still to watch.
Okay, so it says, imagine that you are in the business section of the Barnes & Noble bookstore. You will be shown an image. Once you see it, move on to the next step. What do you think this book is about? Okay, so it says you're holding a field guide for rapid experimentation. Use the 44 experiments inside to find your path to scale. Systematically win big with small bets by testing business ideas. Strategizer.com/test. Strategizer series, sequel to Modern Business Model Generation International Bestseller. 30 plus languages. Okay. So I feel like the main information for whatever this book is about is probably held in this line right here. It has something to do with business ideas, but it is some kind of test or format in experiments to find out which business ideas I think are going to work for you or are going to reap some kind of benefit or be successful. So it's some kind of formula or experiment that's going to help you take any business ideas, I think, into success. And it's different sort of tests, experiments, some kind of methods to figuring out which ones are going to work and which ones aren't, I think. So that's kind of all I could gather from that one line. I wasn't able to gather as much from the other points of information. I think it was mostly held in this line here. So I hope I answered your question. I'll stop here for now and move on to the written portion, but thank you for letting me check this out.
So it's really interesting, right? You'll notice this top blurb, which isn't really a subtitle, is the thing that tested the best. And it was a common theme across every test we did, that little blurb gave people more information than the other images. People did not get from these arrows that the testing meant like you could go different ways. When we had icons, people didn't understand what the icons were. There was one about binoculars, and this woman's like, I don't know what this thing is. And I'm like, it's binoculars. She's like, no, I don't know what it is. And so it was really hard. And you'll notice, even for me now listening to this, it's still hard, because when you test and you just have your customers tell you back what they think you're doing, that's true like voice of the customer work, right? You're trying to use their words or trying to take their input in a way where they understand what you're working on. And so we did rounds and rounds of this kind of testing. And eventually we kind of got to this, which is, we just called the book what it was. We were using, different design elements to do kind of ideas plus testing. But we should have time boxed our testing. So this was really embarrassing. We didn't have the cover ready for when people started pre-ordering on Amazon, and it topped business entrepreneurship with no image. And so in hindsight, I would have coached myself on this and said, oh, we have to time box our testing. And of course we did not. But this is really hard when you do it on your own stuff. You forget about these things. It's also why you need a coach. Maybe I should have had a book coach. I don't know. But the idea of should have time boxed that was kind of embarrassing. But kind of getting into the content of the book, coming back to these themes of desirable, viable, and feasible from design thinking. I first learned this from IDEO, but then I realized it was from Stanford D School. And then I started tracing it back to Larry Keeley, and then it was the Institute of Design from Chicago. But these themes tend to hold up now, no matter if I'm working with an agile team or any other team. This idea of kind of do they, right? When you're looking at your work, is there any evidence that people need this? It fits in their daily lives. It's something that provides value. This question of viability is very much a should we, okay? So is this something we should be working on as a business? Is it aligned to our strategy? Does it generate some kind of value? Is it sustainable? And then, unfortunately, where we spend too much of our time is this feasibility side, where it's can we? And that's not just technical feasibility. I work, and especially you around DC would know this, anything where I'm working heavily regulated industries, feasibility is also about not violating that stuff, right? So if there are right rules and regulations, you could have something that technically works, but in healthcare, if you're violating HIPAA compliance or something like that, it still will not succeed. And so really what I started to do with cross-functional teams and Agile, right, is who is the person that can help answer these desirability questions? Who is the person that can help answer some of these viability questions? And who is the person that can help with these feasibility questions? And this is very similar to Marty Kagan and Jeff Patton thinking of this triad, or what's the leadership team responsible for helping address all of these answers in our projects and in our opportunities. So what we did is we started layering this over the business model canvas. And so basically saying, desirability, viability, feasibility, can this help us with regards to making sure the canvas is a little more clear as far as navigating it? And what we realized was your value prop and your customer and all that, a lot of that is desirability risk. Is this thing desirable? At the bottom, viability is a lot of cost and revenue. Is this a viable thing to do? And then feasibility, backstage, activities, resources, and partners. And then the other big kind of mistake I saw people make was, the flow I typically follow is, what's your value prop? Who's your customer? How do you reach them? And then how do you build relationships with them? What's the nature of the relationship? And then what's your risk, as far as revenue streams? And you'll notice a lot of this is desirability and a little bit of viability, okay? And then backstage, what are the activities you're doing? So think of verbs. What are the things you need? So resources, nouns. What does this cost? And then who do you partner with? And so when I first introduced this tool to Toyota, they were like, oh, this is like a bento box. I was like, yeah, kind of. I mean, you certainly don't start left to right, because I personally would never start with who I'm partnering with as the first part of the strategy. I would say what's our value prop? How do we deliver it to customers? What's the nature of our relationship with them? Okay. How do we generate revenue? And then our activities and our resources can help inform our costs. And then if we're partnering with somebody, they bring an activity or a resource to help us create our value. And when I look at it that way, and I had the pleasure of going through Alex's boot camp in Switzerland about 4 years ago, where he explained a lot of the backstory of how he created the tool. And if you look at the old white papers on it, it looks like a systems thinking diagram. It just ended up being a canvas, but all this stuff is relational. It just kind of relates back and forth. And so when I see people make mistakes with it, they're usually just doing the check the box exercise. And they're saying, oh, yeah, we have value prop. Yep, got a customer. Yep, got revenue. But in reality, when I'm using teams, and I work with multi-billion-dollar corporations, they are looking at what are the ripple effects if they change their customer, or they change their revenue, or they change their channels. And some of that doesn't come out in a business plan or in your backlog. Some of it, it's just easier to facilitate and view in something like this, where you can see the different ripple effects if you change one of those key aspects of your model. So to that extent, I think layering this thinking onto it just helps. And so what we ended up doing is saying, all right, write down all your risks around your canvas, do a 2x2 exercise to map out your risk. For this, I created it a while back. Basically, I learned this from Jeff and Josh, who wrote Lean UX, that I used to work with at Neo, and then I pulled in design thinking into it. So it's basically called assumptions mapping. It's been used by like, Google uses it now for their design sprints, so it kind of got pulled into design sprints. But basically the flow is write down your assumptions, go map them with your team. And the mapping, again, is like what's desirable, what's feasible, what's viable. And important to unimportant, do you have evidence or not have evidence? And then take that stuff that's really risky and go run experiments to learn about it, and then come back and update your map and come back and update your canvas. So it was kind of this like missing piece where people would sketch out canvases and then they would just not know what to do with them, or what kind of tests were available. And what we ended up doing was just applying a taxonomy and saying, hey, if you have this kind of risk, here are the kind of things that are available to you to run. And ideally, like some of these stuff, these things move over time, and they're less like, you have more evidence on them, and then kind of new things pop up, right? But this idea of it's a very iterative process fits really in with Agile. And so when I'm working with Agile teams, a lot of times it takes this kind of form of, okay, what's a story backlog look like? And at the top of the backlog, you're like, yeah, this stuff's awesome. And at the bottom, you're like, I have no idea what's in this thing. Like we have 5 years of Jira tickets in there. I have no idea what's going on. And so what I've been doing with teams running in Agile is, can we like basically apply this kind of thinking to help understand our backlog? And so, if you take this really basic format that we kind of all start with, may or may not use after you adopt it, but I'll start here. Like as a user, I want features so that benefit. You could start saying, okay, well, do we know anything about this user? Is there any evidence to say like this is the user, like, or is it just a product owner kind of just saying it wouldn't be cool if and writing stories? Like, do we actually know? Is there any evidence behind that? With the feature, is there any kind of feasibility stuff? When you think about like XP spikes and things like, is there anything you can do to help kind of walk through the risk around something like a feature? And then with benefits, is it impactful not to just the customer, but also to the company, right? And to the business. You have to measure and kind of walk this line of this idea of like high value jobs where you're solving things for the customer, but they're also valuable to the business. But I just feel like this framing of like desirable, viable, feasible, when I'm working like with a company that's say adopting SAFe or something like that, when they're looking at stuff that moves in, like these epics that come in, they're not traditionally vetting them enough, at least the companies I work with. And then they end up suffering all the kind of impacts of that later down when they're trying to kind of break this stuff down into stories for, more tactical level things. And so what we've been doing when I go into a company that's adopting SAFe and I say, look at your epics, try to do some early discovery work and do some early vetting just to make sure that's worth pulling in. It doesn't have to be this big waterfall thing, but is there anything you could do to kind of start understanding, do we have any risks around here or big assumptions that we're making that we're kind of stating as facts, and then they end up being in the flow, and then you end up generating all this work around it, and we realized, oh, you know what, that was actually that user didn't really need that thing. I know you all kind of live this, but I think anything we can do to add some really actionable tools and framing for people to just modify how they're working today, this is my style anyway, to help them kind of unpack some of this stuff earlier on, so that you're not in this situation where you're kind of loading up your release train with a bunch of stuff that nobody cares about. And so using like these kind of thinking and these methods can really help you drive out some of that uncertainty and help you at least course correct, instead of pulling in these big epics that have all these assumptions and then we treat it as facts in our backlog and execute on it. I think we have to be really, really careful of that dynamic. So what we did is we kind of categorized everything into discovery and into validation. You'll notice cost, setup time, runtime, evidence strength, and themes. So there are all these kind of visualizations on it to say, hey, like, I don't know if our customer really needs this thing. What can we do? And besides just an interview, oh, there's all this other stuff you can do with them. It's just, you need to think about what you're trying to learn, because sometimes, I don't know, people love landing pages, but a landing page doesn't teach you anything about feasibility, like whether you can do it. People love crowdfunding, also doesn't address feasibility, because we've all crowdfunded something that, you know, wasn't able to be produced at the end of the day. So like being able to tie it back to your risk, I think is really important. And then we did the same thing with validation experiments. Again, how much they cost, how much it takes to set them up, run them, what kind of strength they create, and then what kind of themes that they apply to. So something like a data sheet, you know, if I'm working with like a hardware company, they might create this spec using just Word or Pages that doesn't cost a lot, right? But it has like somewhat middle evidence strength in the sense of it's not just people talking. You can actually get feedback on a specific thing. So if you're trying to validate like your partners, you might go to them with a data sheet and have a conversation with them about, can they meet the specs that you're requiring to the end customer? And it doesn't take a long time, and it seems pretty straightforward, but I don't think we treat it as an experiment. We usually treat them as, well, we'll just go sign up a partner, or we'll have to review all these documents. And sometimes you can just run directional kind of experiments to understand if you're on the right track. Boomerang is another one of my favorite in the book, which is competitive testing. So I work with a lot of companies that will recruit people and then point them at their competitor's product and then do testing on it and get feedback on whether or not they're able to complete the tasks, the qualitative feedback. They'll look for kind of weaknesses in their competitor products before they go off and build, build something to compete with them. But in this, you don't have to build anything. You literally recruit people and point them at the competitor. Some of the companies I work with in San Francisco, they would point people at startups they were worried about. And I always felt bad for the startups that way, because they're like, wow, our traffic looks great today. And it's like, no, it's just this corporation that's pointing all their users at you. But I've seen that happen where people will do competitive testing on products to see, is there something there, and kind of generate your own evidence. And then it's like something I wish I could have talked to more in the book, but we ran out of space and time, which was sequences. So, like if you have like B2B software, what I've noticed is teams can start off doing something like a customer interview with, their potential customers. They can go into discussion forums and see, is there more, are there more people talking to that about that rather than like the few customers we spoke to? They can point them at, get people at a boomerang to see, what the strengths and weaknesses of the existing process or competing with look like. They can build a clickable prototype without any working backend and test with customers to see, are we on the right track as far as something that would solve a need? They could, even pre-sell some of it, which means you're not basically charging for it until you ship. And then you could build like that single feature MVP, which is something that, does one thing really well. So think like early days Foursquare or Hotel Tonight or something where you click and it does one thing, but it does that one thing that you can build out from. And I think this is what I'm really excited about when I work with teams, is I'm really curious about how they're stringing stuff together, because it's never I personally have never experienced a team where they ran one experiment and it was a huge success, and then they just like went off and scaled the thing. It was always like, we ran an experiment, didn't go as planned, we learned something else that was kind of interesting, and we followed that thread, and we ended up like creating $1 million business eventually. So just be thinking about, when you're coaching, so I know we have some agile coaches on the call too. When you're coaching your teams, when they run that first experiment, you don't want them getting too excited or too depressed. You want them to kind of look at it objectively, and you need to coach them back up or kind of bring them down, depending on how your team reacts, to say, look, we learned some stuff here. What can we do next? And I usually go for about 12 weeks before making any major decisions on some of this stuff, which is like, if you had an opportunity and you build out their backlog and you're sprinting through it, by 12 weeks, if you're running at least an experiment a week, you should have enough evidence to know whether you should kind of pivot, persevere, or kill that thing based on a series of experiments. So just keep that in mind, that I think some people mistake like testing and lean and agile for like just cheap and dirty, and just you make these big bets off of almost no data. That's not what I'm kind of evangelizing here. It's more of, can we do, like, it's like scientific method applied to business, really. Over a series of time, can we de-risk what we're doing in a way where we can provide evidence also that tests our vision, so like testing it against reality. So something to think about. Look, like running one of these is great. So if you look at your backlog and you go, wow, my teams are worried about like this, this, and this, like having them be able to run experiments, I think is key, but it's never just a one experiment and then we go off and build the rest. It's usually something that, you know, if you look at any kind of dual track agile or this discovery delivery tracks, you'll see more and more of this becoming kind of the norm, which is we're not necessarily waterfalling our discovery into a bunch of delivery sprints. We're actually doing discovery all the time, and we can visualize that as well. So one of the companies I want to talk about really briefly is Topology. So they have their case study in the book. They have a phone, an app for a phone that when you scan your face, basically it measures your face, and then they make glasses specifically for your face. Okay, so it's more more precise than going into an optometrist, which is kind of crazy with all their equipment. And so if you look at something like that, it's like, wow, how do I de-risk something that complex? And pre-pandemic, what they did was a bunch of pop-up stores. So they opened up all these temporary stores, and they basically kind of intercepted people on the street. And so I won't read this all to you, but they basically intercepted people with wearing eyeglasses. They interviewed them to make them, to just see if they're aware of why their glasses did or did not fit well. For the people that had poor fitting glasses, they kind of walked them into the store and guided them through using the app. And the glasses they had were behind a case. And they weren't really even like considering selling them, but they actually pre-ordered a couple. So 4 pairs, actually more than a couple. And, but the real learning they had was from all the qualitative insights of people didn't know why their glasses weren't fitting properly. And they used a lot of the words from the interviews in their marketing material. So they used it in their landing pages, they used it in their ads. And if you go to just their site, right, it's like topologyeyewear.com. You could see like a lot of the plain language they're using is from a lot of experiments they ran where they're trying to de-risk this thing, because if people don't believe it works or people don't have the problem, then it doesn't matter how much you invest in the technology, you're going to fail. So I just thought it was a really interesting example of a company trying something hard, right? It's an app plus you're making glasses, right? So there's complexity there. How do you de-risk that? And I thought it was really fascinating of how they went through it. These last couple slides before we take questions should look very similar or very familiar to all of you, which is things like experiment ceremonies. You'll notice I'm taking a lot of inspiration from Agile here. We usually run in weekly sprints. So we do planning. We say like, what's our learning goal? We prioritize, we task. We have daily stand-ups, but it's more for the discovery side and not just delivery. So keep that in mind. Like if you're trying to weave this into your Agile teams and how they work, have them talk about the discovery work at the stand-up. So have the product owner and the designer, or the product owner and the researcher, you know, talk about, hey, here's the discovery work we're doing, and socialize it. Like it can fit in there because there's a lot of tasks that need to happen to just like line up interviews, to write the scripts, to synthesize all the results, you know. So I am a big believer in socializing that. And so in the stand-up, you can also talk about your discovery work. We do, which was a little different. We do learning meetings, which is people have to bring their data and we actually go through it because we have to sort that and look for insights, which is not trivial. And sometimes we have to borrow a data scientist or somebody. But if you don't make the space for this, people won't take the time to go through the data, and then they'll just basically go off and build what they're looking for. So be careful, make space for that. We also do retrospectives. A lot of the retrospectives we do are about how do we get better at experimentation. So things like training our intuition. Hey, we couldn't get access to this customer. What could we do differently next time? Who do we need like help from? It's a lot about, because it will go wrong, you know. Quite often I'm working with teams who are experimenting for the first time. Things will go poorly, like get poorly integrated in analytics, or we'll go with the wrong group by mistake, or we won't loop in the call center and they'll be blindsided by something we did. There's all this learning. So when we do retros, we really try to talk about how do we get better at experimentation and as a team. And then another thing that, you know, I'm not really pulling from Agile here, but these like decision meetings, which are stakeholder reviews. where we talk about like, here's our learnings, here are the hypotheses we tested, the experiments we ran, the insights we generated, and here's our recommendation to pivot, persevere, or kill based on this in our vision. And then if you're persevering, things like, here's what we need help with, here's what's in our way, and making sure that leadership knows that it's not just giving lip service to working this way, but they understand that they have to actually help you remove some of these maybe barriers that would prevent you from getting access to customer or moving quickly or trying to pre-sell something. Like, it's really interesting. You know, you think of something like crowdfunding and you would say, oh, that's just a startup. Like literally GE's out there crowdfunding stuff. Like some of the major brands you've ever seen are on Indiegogo crowdfunding things. And it's not because they need the money, it's because they're looking for evidence of whether or not anybody cares about the thing that they're about to create. And so it's really fascinating to me to see those things pop up. And when you're kind of making these recommendations, it's like, oh, how do we do a Indiegogo page as a corporation? Are we even allowed to do that? You know? And trust me, if companies like GE Appliances could do it, you're going to figure it out. But it's really interesting to see these techniques shift and kind of shape testing that way. So I think the ones that probably jump out here, they're a little different again, are like the learning meeting and the decision meeting. But everything else should seem pretty similar to Agile. I also take a lot of kind of influence from Kanban and Flow and Lean, and this idea of like visualize stuff and try to get it to flow. So for teams that are working more like in a Kanban flow, we'll have like, basically it's what I would call like an experiment board. And we will help things flow across that board. So you'll notice like if our backlog is like, hey, we're going to do a survey and online ads and a landing page, you know, even in setup, there's something like we need to source all the people, we need to write the script and everything. You know, it can get all clogged up because it is a lot of work. And so, you know, if something gets blocked, right, being able to call that out like, oh, you know what, we're blocked on like sourcing people at the moment. So you can apply all this stuff you're already amazing at with Agile and Lean and Kanban and apply it to your experimentation. Because that's basically what I've done over my career. I kind of grew up in the Agile community and startup community. And I pulled all that, what I learned into, wow, we need a repeatable process for experiments. And so if you look through anything I've created over the years, a lot of it's going to have strong Agile influence, strong Lean influence, strong Kanban influence, because we want to visualize and help things flow. Otherwise, you get these long-running experiments that actually don't help you de-risk, you know, what you're working on. So the book is beautiful. We had 4 designers on it, 4 or 5, I lost count. Hand illustrated all of the experiments. So we tried to make it very actionable, a very foundational level work for people that are stuck and they feel like, wow, like I'm with this Agile team. So product owners have been like buying up this book, like, you know, like hotcakes, with this idea of like, I'm stuck, I don't know what to do next, what's available to me. And so it's been really cool to see it kind of make inroads in the product community and have people say, oh, actually there are all these other things available to me, you know, to make progress. And so really, it's just like this really beautiful landscape book that, you know, it's fun to all see people Instagram and tag me on it. It's been a fun experience for me. But my challenge to kind of all of you before we take questions is, like, I want you to really think about running your experiments from product to business. Like, look across your backlog, look across your roadmap, and don't think of them of like these one-off things you do, but think of them as like, how do you de-risk your initiative? And how do you make it a repeatable process? Because, you know, your risk just moves around. That's basically what happens. So it'll start with the customer, but then it'll move down to like revenue, right, and your viability, and then it'll move back to like feasibility when you're trying to scale, and then when you start scaling, it'll go back to revenue. Like it just keeps moving around. So this idea of kind of continuous discovery, continuous delivery, and how you can inform each other is just, I can't stress it enough. I think any team really wants to work on stuff that they feel like matters, and they want to be able to sort of know, hey, at the end of the day, I made a difference when I completed that story. And so anything you can do to help them get out of their head when they're really worried about something, or they're worried that they're working on something that doesn't matter, like how do you facilitate that? How do you get it out of their head, and how do you run experiments? So that's my challenge to all of you. And with that, we can take some questions.
Thank you, David. That was great. Let's see, this is the first time we're going to try this. So I think we can unmute people and not go through the chat. Let's see if that works. You can now unmute yourself. So if somebody has a question, hopefully we won't jump all together.
So I can say something. Hi, David.
Hi, how are you?
I'm fine. No, this is great. I've been meaning to buy your book for a long time and I haven't yet. So I'm excited to look at it. It looks very visual, which is awesome. And I have two things to say, or one question to ask as well. Is there in the book also text, like explaining each of the models, or is it just visual, like the things he showed us? And the second thing is, when you say you're working with teams, what kind of teams are those? Are they on the innovation side or the actually development teams? You know, that, because I find that is the biggest challenge, is they are so far removed from where the risk is in the hierarchical organizations that exist, you know, around here, where the product manager role is fixed and all of the onus is on them to do the communicating of risk and managing of risk.
Okay, so a couple things. One, yes, there is text, but it does stop short of recommending all the different tools you would use for each one of these. So in that regard, we're creating an online library to complement the book. So I'm working with Alex Osterwalder on that. What I didn't want to do was instantaneously date the book by putting all the tools I use only to have them all go out of business like months later. So it does explain it, although it doesn't give you like, oh, this is how I wire Airtable to unbounce to something else. Like it stops at that point of detail. So it does require a little bit of research on your side to decide what tools to use to go run the experiments. But it does say like, here's how to set them up, here's how to run them, here's how to synthesize the feedback. With the teams I work with, so this has been interesting in my journey. So I often get pulled in at the C-suite. And what happens is they'll take each business line. So I was thinking about like a giant insurance company I was working with recently in the Midwest. And the CEO literally kicks off the engagement in the workshop and says, okay, we need to be able to create new revenue on like this, like we will have 5 to 7 different business units in the room. And what I ended up doing with them is helping them model out where's your risk, and then what kind of experiments do you start, running to unpack that risk? So I have this unique ability to kind of be pulled in by executives, but give them very like tactical things that they could start doing within their business units. But I have to say, if you think of like H1, H2, H3, as far as like Horizon 1, Horizon 2, Horizon 3, most of my work is in Horizon 2 and 3. If I'm pulled into Horizon 1, like cash cow thing, then it's usually like we want to, there's a big feature or something we're unsure of and we want to test it, So a lot of my work isn't in the business as usual with predictable ROI groups, because in those groups, I feel like they're doing something that works and it's, they're making progress. Where I'm usually get pulled in is where there's something new that we're about to try, whether it be a feature on an existing product or a completely new product or a new business in general. How do we de-risk that? Because a lot of these companies no longer give space to the people that can creatively think about those. They're used to just saying, here's stuff to go execute on. So I hope that answers your question, but it's really unique for me because I work in so many different industries. Like I work in pharma, automotive, consumer packaged goods, software. Like it's pretty fascinating to see how these principles apply across those. The techniques look a little different, like the tactics look a little different, but the principles of working on something new, does anybody care? Does it move the needle in business wise? And then can we actually do it? Always applies no matter what industry I'm working in. So it's been really fascinating.
All right. Anybody else?
This is Stephen. you've mentioned industries and business, but in government, the product might be unclear or doesn't exist. Instead, we often talk about mission. How might we apply testing business ideas to government?
So that's a great question. I do work with government. So I do, well, pre-pandemic, I used to fly back into DC and help out. I've worked with the IMF recently. I use a variant of the business model canvas called the mission model canvas. I can put the link in the slides that we distribute here if you like. It is something that Alex Osterwalder, basically Steve Blank, who I-Core and NSF, and he wrote 4 Steps, The Epiphany, and a bunch of other really like foundational works for lean startup. He realized that using that tool was really tough for government and for nonprofits. And so basically they tweaked the tool to have different boxes for places where it just made more sense and resonated more with government. So things like measuring impact, having buy-in, they're just, it's not a completely different canvas, but it's different enough that that's the one I use if I'm working with, like, let's say a Code for America or somebody, or IMF or someone like that. I recently wrote like a Medium article on how I apply this thinking to that. So I'm happy to give you all the link to that as well. But yeah, don't force this tool in a way where you're having conversations about things that aren't helping you make progress. So I would suggest using the mission model canvas, and then the experiments you run are really trying to drive impact, not necessarily like generate revenue. So I'm happy to link that stuff out and put it in the back of the slides for you.
Thank you.
All right. Anybody else? We have time for one more question. Okay. Looks like that's it.
Good job explaining, I guess.
Fantastic. So we're gonna wrap it up with a drawing. For David, I'm gonna ask you to pick a number from 1 to 44. Pick a number from 1 to 44.
Oh, all right. I'm gonna go 42 on that one.
42 on that one. All right. Give me 1 second here. 1, 2, 3.
Sorry, I picked up.
Hi, are you with us?
Yes.
All right. You won David's book, so I'll ping you and get contact info so we figure out whether you want a digital copy or a physical copy. Congrats.
Awesome. Thank you.
All right.
I'm lucky.
You are, absolutely. It's your lucky day. Now you can buy a lottery ticket as well. All right. So quick reminder to everybody, our next meeting is August 3rd, I believe. We're going to have a lean coffee session on August 3rd. And then on August 17th, we're going to have Hisham and Roy talking about their agile transformation journey at the Carlisle Group. So hopefully we can see you there. We'll send out the invites on Meetup. And thanks again, David. Really appreciate you joining us, and hope to see everybody soon.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, David. Thank you, everyone.